I still get chills every time I think about that night. It started with a single deafening gunshot that shattered the stillness of the forest. One moment, we were lying in our tents, surrounded by the eerie quiet of Northern California, and the next, we were frozen in fear. That sound, sharp, sudden, and final, felt like it had torn through the entire wilderness. Silence followed, an unnatural, oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I opened my tent flap cautiously, my hands trembling. My friends, wide-eyed and pale, were doing the same. None of us spoke a word. What could we say? We were just kids, alone in the wilderness with nothing but our backpacks and a thin layer of nylon between us and whatever had just happened out there. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. That night, the forest didn't feel like the vast, endless sanctuary we had grown to love. It felt like a predator, watching and waiting for its moment to strike. We had been camping for 3 months, journeying through the untamed beauty of the Pacific Northwest. It was a dream trip, until we reached that small, forgotten town. The kind of town you'd drive through without a second glance. One main road, a gas station, a post office, and a dingy little bar that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows over the cracked asphalt as we set up camp a few miles outside the town limits. It had seemed like just another night. We were exhausted, laughing softly around a small campfire as the sky faded to black. But as the stars appeared, so did a gnawing sense of unease. It was subtle at first, just a faint prickle of something being off. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to paranoia from too many ghost stories shared around the fire. If only I'd known. In the dead of night, a sound shattered the fragile peace, screaming. Not one voice, but 3, distant yet distinct. Panic, rage, fear. It was the kind of sound that makes your blood run cold. I shot up in my sleeping bag, my pulse racing as I strained to hear the words. But they were too far, garbled and drowned out by the heavy canopy of trees. My friends were awake now too, their faces reflecting my own terror. We sat there paralyzed as the voices escalated into a crescendo of chaos. Then, just as suddenly as it started, there was a gunshot. One single, terrible shot that rang through the forest like a warning. The screaming stopped. Absolute silence fell, heavy and suffocating, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We didn't dare move. The tent felt like both a shield and a trap. Every sound seemed magnified, the rustle of leaves, the crack of a twig. I kept expecting to hear footsteps, the approach of something or someone that shouldn't be out there. But the night remained still. Too still. The usual chorus of crickets and distant owls was gone, replaced by an oppressive quiet that pressed against my ears. I glanced at my friends, their faces pale in the dim light. No one spoke. It was as if we all knew the same unspoken truth. We were not alone. Whatever had happened out there was too close, too dangerous. My mind raced with possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. Was someone hurt? Was someone dead? And what if the people responsible were still out there, watching us? When dawn finally broke, the forest felt different. The sunlight filtering through the trees seemed too bright, too cheerful, as if mocking the terror we had endured. We packed up camp in silence, the events of the night before hanging heavy in the air. No one wanted to talk about it, but the fear lingered in every glance, every hurried movement. We decided to pass through the town one last time, hoping to find some answers. But the town was as quiet and unremarkable as ever. The locals barely looked at us, their faces hard and unwelcoming. It was as if they knew what had happened but chose to ignore it, to pretend it was just another night in a place where dark things were best left unspoken. Later, we learned more about the area. Northern California's wilderness isn't just remote, it's lawless. With one sheriff patrolling 3 counties, it's a place where secrets are buried deep, both figuratively and literally. Rumors swirled about drug runners and corrupt officials, about disappearances that were never investigated. It hit us then. If we had reported the gunshot, it wouldn't have mattered. No one would have come. Worse, we might have drawn unwanted attention to ourselves. In a place like this, curiosity could get you killed. We were just kids, hitchhiking with nothing but our wits and a few supplies. The realization hit hard. If someone had wanted to make us disappear that night, they could have. No questions, no consequences. To this day, I can't shake the memory of that night. The gunshot, the screams, the silence. It's etched into my mind a dark reminder of how fragile we are in the face of true wilderness, and the darker forces that lurk within it. I often wonder what really happened out there. Who screamed, who fired the gun, and why? But maybe it's better not to know. In places like that, knowing too much can be dangerous. All I know is that I'll never set foot in that part of California again. Some places are better left unexplored, their secrets left buried, and their silence left undisturbed. It was the kind of night that makes you feel completely alone in the world. My friend and I were in my dad's old cabin, nestled deep in the Idaho wilderness. The nearest town was 50 miles away, and the closest road was 2 miles of uneven logging trail. The silence out there wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of the wind outside felt magnified. We were just lying in our bunks, talking nonsense, trying to fall asleep after a long day. That's when it happened. A sound that sliced through the stillness like a razor. A scrape against the door. We both froze. "Did you hear that?" my friend whispered. I laughed nervously, brushing it off as the wind. But the unease lingered. Then came the knock. Slow. Deliberate. A heavy hand rapping against the wood. No voice followed, just that sound, echoing in the middle of nowhere. My stomach twisted into knots. There wasn't supposed to be anyone out here. We didn't move, didn't speak. The darkness in the cabin felt suffocating. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal, a lost hiker, or something worse? The knocking came again, steady and deliberate. My friend and I exchanged wide-eyed glances, both too petrified to make a sound. We weren't kids. We were grown men in our 30s, but in that moment, we were as scared as children. The lantern was off, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon through the window. I strained my ears, trying to catch any other sound. Footsteps, breathing, but there was nothing, just the knock. I thought about grabbing the rifle we'd left by the fireplace, but fear rooted me in place. What if opening that door was the worst mistake we could make? The knocking stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the cabin. But it didn't feel like we were alone. Every second stretched into eternity. I swear I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My friend whispered, "Do we check?" But neither of us moved. Instead, we lay there, stiff as boards, staring at the door. Hours crawled by. Every creak, every gust of wind felt like a threat. When the first rays of sunlight finally pierced through the window, we found the courage to move. Armed with nothing but the rifle and shaky resolve, we slowly opened the door. The forest was calm, bathed in soft morning light. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone or anything near the cabin. It was as if the night had erased itself. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had been a tree branch swaying in the wind, though there were no trees close enough to the door. Maybe it was some animal, though there were no tracks. Deep down, we both knew better. Something had been out there. Something that knocked. But why? And what did it want? The unease followed us for the rest of the day. Every shadow in the woods seemed to hold a hidden figure. Every distant sound made us jump. We decided to cut our trip short. Whatever had visited us that night, we didn't want to stick around for a repeat performance. Packing up the cabin was a tense affair. We moved quickly, stealing nervous glances at the door every few minutes, half expecting it to happen again. Back in town, we shared our story with a few locals. Their reactions were unsettling. Some laughed it off as a spooky campfire tale. Others went quiet, their faces clouded with unease. One older man pulled us aside. "You're lucky," he said. "Not everyone who hears that knock gets to ignore it." His words sent a chill down my spine. What did he mean? Was this some local legend we'd stumbled into? A warning we didn't understand? Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that whatever knocked on that door is still out there. Sometimes I dream about that night. The sound of the knock echoes in my ears, pulling me back to that cabin in the middle of nowhere. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. It's irrational, I tell myself. It's just a memory. But the fear is real. Sometimes I wonder, what if we had opened the door? Would we have found a person in need? Or would we have faced something unexplainable, something that doesn't belong in our world? The not knowing is the worst part. It leaves a crack open for fear to slip through, even years later. I've tried to let it go, but I can't. That knock wasn't just a sound, it was a message, a question, a challenge, and I'll never know what would have happened if we had answered it. Every time I think about it, I feel that same knot in my stomach, that same icy grip of dread. Some doors are better left closed, I tell myself, but deep down, I know that the cabin, the knock, and the fear will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was hiking off the main trail along the river that day, chasing a moment of peace. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees. It was supposed to be a simple outing, just me, the sound of the water, and the crunch of leaves underfoot. But then I noticed him. At first, it seemed innocent enough. Just an older guy in a Hawaiian shirt, his chest glistening with sweat under the open fabric. Maybe he was just another hiker, I told myself, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. But as I walked, I realized he wasn't just another hiker. He was following me. His footsteps mirrored mine, not far behind. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. After all, it was a public trail. But the way he kept glancing my way, his gaze lingering a little too long, sent a shiver crawling down my back. Something about him felt off. I pressed on, my pace quickening as I tried to shake him. The trail narrowed, and the sound of the river grew louder. I thought if I kept moving, he'd give up, lose interest, or maybe just disappear. But he didn't. His presence was a constant weight on my mind, a shadow that refused to fade. I reached a steep bank, the trail abruptly ending in a tangle of roots and loose dirt. It was an impasse. The river rushed below, its current swift and unforgiving. Turning around was my only option, and that meant passing him. My heart pounded as I turned back, each step heavier than the last. As I retraced my steps, I saw him ahead, waiting on the trail like he'd been expecting me. My instincts screamed at me to avoid him. I veered off into a thick canebrake, the tall grass scratching at my arms and legs as I pushed through. It wasn't a path, but it offered some distance between us, or so I thought. When I emerged from the brush, he was there, as if he'd known exactly where I'd come out. He stepped closer, a crooked grin on his face, his breath labored. "Hey," he said, his voice low and slimy. "Looking for a good time?" Panic surged through me. My mind raced, trying to process his words, his tone, the way his eyes seemed to devour me. "Fuck no," I spat, my voice trembling but defiant. My feet moved before my brain caught up, carrying me away from him as fast as they could. The trees blurred around me. I didn't care about the branches clawing at my skin or the uneven ground threatening to trip me. All that mattered was putting distance between us. His footsteps crashed behind me, heavy and determined. He was following me again. The forest seemed endless, the river my only guide. I glanced over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of his figure moving through the trees. My lungs burned, my legs screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop. The fear of what he might do if he caught me drove me forward. I veered toward the sound of the water, hoping the river could offer some kind of escape. But as I neared the edge, the bank gave way beneath my feet. I tumbled, landing hard on the rocky shore below. Pain shot through my ankle, but there was no time to dwell on it. I scrambled to my feet, limping along the riverbank. He appeared at the top of the bank, his silhouette framed by the dying light. His grin was gone now, replaced by something darker, more menacing. "You can't run forever," he called, his voice echoing over the water. Desperation clawed at me. I grabbed a jagged rock from the riverbed, holding it in front of me like a weapon. "Stay back!" I screamed, my voice raw. He didn't move, just stared down at me, his expression unreadable. The river roared between us, a cold, unrelenting force that mirrored the terror in my chest. And then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone. One moment he was there, the next he vanished into the shadows of the forest. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest, waiting for him to reemerge. But he didn't. I limped my way back to civilization, every sound in the forest sending fresh waves of panic through me. When I finally reached the parking lot, it was empty. No sign of him, no sign that he'd ever been there at all. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd felt. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting for someone else to wander off the trail, waiting for another good time. For what felt like forever, it was just me and him, a stranger in a ski mask, staring at each other in the middle of a desolate, snow-covered forest. The air was freezing, and every exhale was a puff of white mist. It was 3 a.m., and I was utterly alone. It started as an ordinary night during winter break. I was visiting my cousins in North Dakota. We'd spent the evening at a friend's house, the basement filled with laughter, music, and the smell of cheap beer. As the night stretched on, exhaustion crept over me. My head felt heavy, and my eyelids threatened to close. Deciding to call it a night, I told my cousins I'd walk back home. It wasn't far, just a familiar path through some woods and across open land. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I made my way through the dark. The moon lit the snow-covered ground with an eerie glow, casting long shadows from the barren trees. My breath came in short bursts, both from the cold and the residual buzz of alcohol. Despite the late hour, the night felt calm, almost too calm. But that calm shattered the moment I looked up. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Just beyond my line of sight at my 10 o'clock, I noticed a figure moving in the distance. They were walking in the opposite direction, their silhouette blending into the shadows of the trees. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was probably just someone else heading home. Then, he saw me. He froze, his entire body jerking slightly as if startled. For reasons I couldn't explain, I let out a nervous laugh, waving awkwardly. "Oh, you startled me," I murmured, my voice barely audible in the freezing air. He didn't laugh. He didn't wave back. He just stood there, staring. The ski mask obscured his face, but I could feel his gaze burning into me. My chest tightened as unease crawled up my spine. The world seemed to go silent. No wind, no crunching snow, nothing but the sound of my own rapid heartbeat. I didn't know how long we stood there, locked in this unnerving standoff. A part of me wanted to speak, to ask if he needed help, but the words wouldn't come. Something about him felt wrong. Not just the mask, but the way he stood, unnaturally still, like he was waiting for something. The silence was unbearable. My instincts screamed at me to move, to run, but I was frozen, my feet rooted in the snow. Then, without warning, I saw him take a single step forward. That was all it took for me to snap out of my trance. My body surged with adrenaline, and I turned on my heel, walking as fast as I could without breaking into a sprint. But every fiber of my being told me he was still watching. That's when I ran. I didn't care about the noise I made or how deep the snow was. I just ran, the cold air slicing through my lungs and tears stinging my eyes. I couldn't shake the image of him sprinting after me, axe in hand, his ski mask hiding whatever horrifying expression he might have. Every crunch of snow beneath my boots sounded louder, as if mocking my attempts to escape. My thoughts spiraled into chaos. Would he find me? Would he follow my tracks in the snow? The fear was suffocating, wrapping around my chest like a vice. The outline of my cousin's house finally came into view. Relief washed over me, but I didn't slow down, not until I was inside. I slammed the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. My heart was still racing, the echo of my scream playing over and over in my head. My cousins looked up, startled, asking what had happened. I tried to explain, but my words came out jumbled and panicked. There was someone in the woods, I managed to say, just standing there staring at me. They exchanged uneasy glances, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Maybe it was the alcohol, or the fact that nothing ever seemed to happen in their quiet town, but they didn't take me seriously. I wanted to insist, to make them understand, but I was too exhausted to argue. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, watching. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows made my heart pound. When morning came, I looked outside, half expecting to see footprints leading up to the house. But there was nothing. No sign of him, no indication that anyone had been there. But I know what I saw. That feeling, that primal, gut-wrenching fear, wasn't something I could have imagined. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted. I never told my parents, and I haven't visited my cousin since. Some nights, when I'm alone, I think about that moment. I wonder if he's still out there, wandering those woods, waiting for someone else to cross his path. And every time, I'm grateful that I ran. Because maybe, just maybe, that's what saved my life.